Chair Lydia Sassini is out. Carol's not here.
So
I've got Grant Barnes. He's the General Manager of Licensing Compliance. He's come up to the table here, can help you answer any questions, and it's really at the moment. So, Lydia, we're in your hands. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair and Councillors and IMSB member, for the opportunity to speak to this issue, proliferation of boarding houses in Auckland.
What's happening here, Lydia?
I'm not sure what's happened.
He might have to move it along himself. Hey, there we
Okay.
are.
So in early June, I presented a slide and a presentation to the Community Safety and Development Committee to raise this issue of proliferation, particularly with living standards in the boarding houses. We have a number of social issues in our community with respect to boarding houses, including a convicted rapist being housed near a local primary school. I recommended to the committee through our advocacy, through unitary plan and ongoing advocacy, the need for council to take a lead in thinking about how do we ensure boarding houses provide quality living standards. And in particular, we've been hearing about a number of horror stories in our local community. We're really concerned the definition of a boarding house in various legislative documents as well as in councils. And we've been listening to these stories because of the increasing trend for private homes in our local community being converted into boarding houses to help pay for the huge mortgages currently being experienced. We've heard of a number of homes that separate families, including children, in every room of the house, including the garage, and exorbitant charges of $200 to $300 per week. These houses aren't recorded anywhere. And as far as everyone is concerned, from our view, there isn't a boarding house problem, so there isn't a need to monitor this particular issue. And a number of residents are too scared to say anything because they may lose their accommodation, and it is about affordability of housing. So, Chair and Committee, in recent months, as you're all aware, homelessness has become a very hot topic in the news. For us, it's also related to boarding houses and the ability to our region to provide quality housing options for all. Added to that is the housing shortages, which everyone is fully aware of, and an issue of concern is not only for our local board but for government as well. Current government initiated a report into boarding houses in 2011, which wasn't completed, but it was restarted and then completed subsequently in 2014. It has identified a number of problems in the way of addressing boarding houses. There is a real lack of a single clear definition of what a boarding house is. Legislation and regulations for boarding houses is currently fragmented. Poor living standards that we have seen in many of the boarding houses, and although that's anecdotal, some of that evidence has been presented by our own council officers' reports. Governments and councils' passive approach to compliance, and lack of education for the community and landlords. The report highlighted that government has a hands-off approach to monitoring and compliance, and most councils don't even believe they have a problem with boarding houses. So, Chair and Council, in our view, it is a fundamental issue that no one, not council or government, or even the social services, really understand how widespread and serious this issue is. For your information, we have ongoing discussions with local police, and there seems to be different lists of the boarding houses that police have to attend to in terms of the list and what is recorded. This confirms the fact that we as an organisation and governors need to better understand this issue. It also highlights the manage with our current situation and the boarding houses we work with. For your information, we are not against boarding houses. We believe that they play an important part of Auckland's housing future. But what we do believe is that the council needs to be more proactive in these types of facilities and identify the issues and develop meaningful responses or a mechanism that results in better outcomes for our community. So the key issue for us through the chair is that there's no real understanding of actual numbers, there's no way of confirming standards of boarding houses to do with safe and sanitary, and there's no way of tracking trends in growth of boarding houses facilities, specifically growth of residential home conversions. So the question that I want to ask is, how should Auckland Council manage boarding houses into the future? Is it a bylaw? Where's the evidence? And where can the decision be made in terms of this issue that we raise? Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Lydia. McGrath, have you got any comments on the issues that Lydia's raised there? Because I think there's a parliamentary. It's not a full across the Parliament look at this, but I think some of the parties, I think Labor and the Greens, are looking at this at the moment. But have you got any views on this? Councillor Casey's also been looking at it.
Thank you, Mr Chair. So staff acknowledge the views of the Mangere Otahuhu Local Board and expressly thank them for their assistance in the recent proactive compliance program that the Regulatory Services Directorate concluded. Just by way of background, councillors will be familiar with the recently concluded review of bylaws that was conducted up to November 2014. This matter, the matter of a bylaw for boarding houses, was extensively canvassed and explored by the Regulatory and Bylaws Committee under Councillor Penrose's chairmanship. In July 2015, the Regulatory and Bylaws Committee resolved, concluded that current legislative provisions are adequate for council to address the standard of boarding houses in Auckland. And I make reference, therefore, to the Building Act, the Resource Management Act, the Residential Tenancy Act, the Health Act, and a raft of other subsidiary regulations. Those statutory tools are powerful in their own right and give my team and my colleagues sufficient powers under those various statutes to take action where it's warranted. In conjunction with the committee's resolution, staff were also instructed to develop a proactive compliance program that we reported the second year of results to the Regulatory and Bylaws Committee in July. This program is multi-department, multi-agency, and proactive in its outlook and outreach. In reporting the second round of findings, staff noted that in the initial round of inspections, there was a very high rate of non-compliance with those boarding houses inspected, primarily in the realm of fire safety, overcrowding, and unsanitary conditions. In each of those instances, the Building Act, the Resource Management Act, and the Health Act allowed us to address those issues with the boarding house owner and operator, such that when staff went back to those sites, compliance had been achieved in all cases. The second round, recently concluded in Otahuhu, saw a lesser rate of non-compliance. We believe that in staff actively monitoring and progressing compliance in the boarding houses, that the message is getting out in some quarters. I have, though, spoken recently with building consent colleagues, and we do acknowledge that there is a wider issue around unconsented minor dwellings. You are no doubt familiar with recent media, particularly on News Hub, that showed 3-bedroom homes converted into multiple tenancies. My point there is, again, where conditions are identified as being substandard or not in accordance with good building practice, there are statutory provisions available to council to address them. It's staff's advice that the addition of a bylaw would not be helpful in this regard. Staff do suggest that this committee's encouragement of further proactive compliance and monitoring by the Regulatory Services Department would be a good thing to hear.
Thank you. Questions of Lydia or Councillor John Watson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lydia, you've presented a pretty disturbing scenario here whereby this kind of de facto spread of boarding houses, even though they maybe don't meet that formal classification, is increasing, and if it's increasing in your area, there'll be plenty of other areas where it's just the same. You're familiar with from a local board. What's your view in terms of the ability or the proactive approach that Mr. Barnes has outlined in terms of dealing with what you're seeing happening on the ground, which seems to be increasing and which seems to require something of an urgent response as opposed to a policy development or some such other mechanism?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Watson. In terms of where we are locally, the problem is we've got increasing homelessness in our community. I've been to 3 of the 4 community events and seeing what I'm seeing on the ground, and some people around the table also attended to support that issue. What we are pleading for is a stronger mechanism and a stronger monitoring in terms of the provisions. I take note and I thank the Officer Barnes for providing, but it's adequate. And given that the housing issue is a massive issue, the people at the bottom of the scale are gagged or responding in a very, it's not a good situation where we are. And obviously other boards will have the same issue, particularly where the economic wealth, which is a whole nother issue. And so we're talking to police who are responding in their powers for the issues that they do. I'm getting feedback from school principals who haven't seen the issue lighten or asking what council is doing. So I appreciate the information from the officers. However, it's adequate, hence my point. We need to strengthen in terms of a response, and I appreciate there's unitary plan, that's a whole different mechanism tool for council that council will decide on soon. But I need to continue to highlight the issue of boarding houses, and the tools that are in place are adequate. Well, I'm not satisfied with adequate because we're talking about families at the bottom end. So that's the only answer I can give you anecdotally, Councillor, at this stage. So that's our plea. Adequate's not good enough for our community, councillors.
Thank you. Councillor Swax.
Mr. Chairman, thanks, but actually Grant has given a very fulsome answer to a lot of the questions that I had, so I thank him for that. And I don't
Okay, well, we've got a B that's going to go up on the board in a minute. So, and then Councillor Casey.
Oh, yeah. Recent experience of a complaint by a boarding house resident brought into play all those pieces of legislation that Grant was talking about, and the response from council was immediate and sensitive, I think. But my question is to Grant, and it's about, I understand that complaints are dealt with well, but what about the proactive policing that Lydia is asking for? The particular boarding house that you inspected had been annually inspected, but that's a kind of cursory inspection and a ticking of the boxes. In actual fact, there was a non-consented premise that has gone on for years and years. So that my question is, I have a worry about that. What are you doing to proactively police boarding houses and give it the real once over, not the ticking of the boxes?
So the operational plan that was developed sees building control, my department and resource consents working with the fire safety and conducting an annual inspection of a cohort of known boarding houses. The first round we did 19, the second round we did 5. The committee can draw its own conclusion whether and your expertise, you think we should be doing more. That is the plan at the moment, that we do it on an annual basis. I can attest to the success of those places that we did monitor, where we did find severe and serious non-compliance. That was rectified as a consequence of our intervention. So it demonstrates to me as your compliance manager that us getting involved is positive, but I'll leave it to your determination about whether we should be doing more of that in light of other pressing matters the Directorate is facing.
The answer is yes, and I'm looking forward to the B, which I can't read.
I'll put it up. Oh, you can't read it? I'll just, it's B is express support for the continuance of the proactive compliance approach to monitoring and inspection of boarding houses in Auckland, and, excuse me, and request an update on inspections and observations in early 2017.